Hey, welcome back, biology students. Today we're going to continue on with our macromolecules, and this time we're going to be working with the protein and the nucleic acid. So get out your notebooks, and I'll change screens and we'll get started. So we're still working in our Unit 1, Concept 3 on biological macromolecules, and we're going to be looking at the functions of the protein and the nucleic acid. Let's just do a quick macromolecule review again. There are 6 elements necessary for life. They compose of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. And the 4 macromolecules are the carbohydrate, which gives you short-term fast-acting energy, the lipid, which gives you long-term energy, and then the proteins and the nucleic acids. Let's get into it. The carbohydrate, as you recall, gives you 4 calories per gram of fuel. Its main function is energy storage on a short-term basis. It's also used for structure and transport and signaling for the cell. You find the carbohydrate in sugars and starches. It's composed of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, or the CHO. The monomer is the monosaccharide. Those are the single sugar molecules. The polymer is the polysaccharide. Those are the larger sugar molecules. And then we have our friend, the lipids. The lipids provide 9 calories per gram of energy, and their main function is energy storage on a long-term basis. Some other uses are insulation, protection, and structure of the cell. You find lipids in fats, oils, the phospholipids in the cell membrane, and steroids. It's also composed of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Its monomer is the fatty acid, and its polymer are the triglycerides. Let's move on to these proteins. Now, we talk about main functions of these macromolecules, but for the protein, there is no main function at all. It's because the protein does so much in the body, there is no main function other than they run your body. There are enzymes that control the rate of biochemical reactions. There are hormones that regulate the cell processes, such as insulin. Structurally, proteins make up the bones and muscle. They're part of collagen. And for transport, they transport substances in and out of the cell, such as hemoglobin. Some other functions are they help the immune system fight diseases with antibodies. They are part of the contractile proteins, which aid in the movement. Every time a muscle contracts and expands, it's because of a protein. They're also involved in the receptors, and they aid in cell signaling between the cell functions and the parts inside the organelles. So these proteins have so many functions in our body. Now, besides being the proteins in our body that help us function, proteins are also an energy source in the food that we eat. So it's really important that you get this distinction here, is that our body is all run by proteins, but we also need to eat proteins for a food source. Now, you're all familiar with proteins in foods. It's found in meats, nuts, dairy products, but many of the proteins are also made by your body. And when we get into our unit on nutrition next week, you're going to see how proteins are important to help you make more proteins. Proteins are composed of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. Proteins are made up of all of those elements, and we'll call them the CHONSPs. I can't say that. It's kind of funny. The monomer of the protein is the amino acids. The polymers are the polypeptides. And the polypeptides are amino acids linked together by a peptide bond. Now, proteins provide us with energy storage, but only 4 calories per gram. Remember, your carbohydrate gives you 4 calories per gram of short-term energy. The lipid gives you 9 calories per gram of long-term energy. And the proteins do have energy storage of 4 calories per gram. But we're not going to be eating or using the proteins that our body produces for energy. We're going to be using proteins that we take in from other food sources. And so proteins do so much inside your body that they're actually the last resort for energy should you actually need to use your proteins for fuel. You have to think about it this way. We eat a variety of foods every day. Some of them have carbohydrates in them, some of them have lipids in them, some of them have proteins in them. And our body starts to burn that fuel. And when we get into our unit on nutrition next week, the average teenager uses between 1,800 and 2,200 calories a day of fuel to run how you do things. Me at my age, my height and weight, I use about 1,850 calories a day is what I need to run how my body works. And so depending upon how you structure the amount of foods and what kind of foods you eat, if you're only eating carbohydrates, you'll find that your energy level changes throughout the day, because as soon as all of those carbohydrates have been used up, you're going to have to tap into the fats. And if you don't have enough fats, then you're ultimately going to end up going over to your proteins. And we don't want to do that just yet. So the proteins for a food source for us are found in meats, nuts, and dairy. And they're composed of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and sulfur. There are some common foods with protein: meats, chicken, fish, nuts, butter, cheese, similar to some of the foods we talked about with the lipids. And these are good sources of protein for you. They'll give you about 4 calories per gram for energy. And your body needs proteins to make proteins. So it's very important that you eat a certain amount of proteins every day so your body can use those proteins to help you make more proteins. Now, proteins are really kind of interesting because they fold into certain shapes, and each of those shapes actually tells the body what they're supposed to do. So proteins are the most diverse macromolecule in terms of structure and function. There are 4 levels to their structure, and we're going to walk through those slowly. The form dictates their function. What shape they take on actually dictates what they do in the body. That shape determines what it does. So the primary structure is this long bead at the top. That's the primary structure, and that's the amino acid sequence. We're not going to get into what the sequencing does, but I just want you to be familiar with these particular terms. The secondary structure is where it starts to create a helix, and we'll learn more about the helix when we talk about the nucleic acids and when we get into DNA. But the helix, or the alpha helix, is a single twisted strand. After the secondary structure, they create the tertiary structure, which also creates the polypeptide chain that's bent to form the shape. From there becomes a quaternary structure where 2 or more polypeptide chains bind together. And so these different shapes determine what that protein's going to do. Now, The fourth macromolecule that we're going to talk about is the nucleic acids. The main function is that this is an informational molecule that store, transmit, and express our genetic information. And it contains the instructions for making the proteins. So I want you to think of the nucleic acids as the information storage molecule. It takes all the information from the DNA and the RNA and the genetic information, and it contains the instructions for making the proteins. You'll find the nucleic acids in DNA and the RNA, and that stands for deoxyribonucleic acid and ribonucleic acid. And we'll get into more of those a little bit later in the semester. But the nucleic acids are found in DNA. And you get the DNA from your parents, not from your food. So that DNA is what has all the instructions for how your body is supposed to function. Now, the nucleic acids are composed of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus. So let's think back for a moment. We have our carbohydrates and our lipids, which are C, H, and O. The proteins are C, H, O, N, P, S. And the nucleic acids are C, H, O, N, P. Now, the monomer of the nucleic acid is the nucleotide. The nucleotide contains these chemical compounds: adenine, guanine, thymine, cytosine, and uracil. A, G, T, C, and U. They're made up of a 5-carbon sugar, which we can see here in this illustration, a phosphate group, and a nitrogen-containing base. So the monomer of the nucleotides, they're made up of a 5-carbon sugar, a phosphate group, and a nitrogen base. The polymer of the nucleic acid is called a nucleic acid, and that is the DNA and the RNA. So it takes the nucleotides to combine together to make the DNA and the RNA. Now, the nucleic acids have no energy storage whatsoever. We're not using them for fuel. They just carry information. And so they're never broken down as a source of energy whatsoever. The nucleic acids are only carrying information. So we talk about common foods for the other macromolecules. There's all kinds of stuff, but there are no common foods for the nucleic acid because we never use them for energy, only for carrying genetic information. So let's review these macromolecules for today. Proteins are the most diverse macromolecule in terms of structure and function. They're composed of the carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. The monomer of a protein is the amino acid. The polymer of the protein is the polypeptide, and it's amino acids that are linked together by a peptide bond. Proteins have 4 calories per gram of energy storage. And because the proteins do so much in your body, they're usually one of the last resorts that the body goes to for energy if it's needed. But we do need to eat proteins to run our body for fuel and to make more proteins. The nucleic acids are just informational molecules that store, transmit, and express our genetic information and contain all the instructions for making the proteins. You'll find the nucleic acids in the DNA and the RNA, and you get them from your parents, not from your food. They're composed of the carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus elements. monomer of the nucleic acid is the nucleotide. That includes adenine, guanine, thymine, cytosine, and uracil. And the polymer is the nucleic acid, which is the DNA or the RNA. Now, after you've updated your notes, remember these slides are also posted for you. Review those notes, go over the proteins and the nucleic acids, and then also go back and take a look at the carbohydrates and the lipids. Open up the assignment. You're going to answer some questions on proteins, nucleic acids, and a little bit of review. And that's all we have for you today. Take some time, update your notes. If you have any questions, make sure you message me or email me, and we'll see you on the next step. You guys have a great day. I'm going to stop my screen share and say so long, biology students.